So why would anybody consider harvesting corn at 25% as dry corn? Phantom yield loss. This is the number one reason to harvest corn over 22% moisture. So, what's phantom yield loss? It is when the corn matures and starts to dry down, the germ finishes maturing in the kernel and uses up density of the kernel. So if you can harvest that corn when it is above 22%, you're going to get the most weight per kernel of corn. So with phantom yield loss, you can lose up to 8-9% of your crop through phantom yield loss. So phantom yield loss, that's the number one reason to harvest corn over 22%. Weather, snow, wind, mud. This tends to be regional, depending where you're located in the US. You might be able to harvest corn in December, January with no problems. Depending where you're at, snow is a real problem. Wind knocking your corn down is a real problem. Mud. Some areas, late in the fall, you run into mud, getting stuck, making ruts in the field. What does that cost? What does it cost you to have ruts in your field or to get stuck? What does it cost you to have a field of corn blow down? What percentage of the crop does that cost you? What about snow? What about a couple inches of snow, dealing with snow on the corn? What does that cost? If you can calculate that cost for your area, if you deal with that issue, you can calculate if it's worth drying 25% corn. Ambient temperature, also listed as a regional issue. Ambient temperature does it take more gas to dry 10% removal at 70 degrees outside, or 5% removal at 20 degrees outside? Like, this is stuff that can be figured out, and there's usually a little more this is somewhat of a minor cost thing on whether it's 70 degrees outside or 20 degrees outside when you're drying your corn, but this is a number that calculates into the overall picture. Because if you look at it and you have 7% phantom yield loss, you have pulling ruts in the field, corn down, and ambient temperature, we're soon starting to add up to a number that may make it worth looking at having a grain dryer and being able to get your corn off the field earlier, so that way when the winter weather sets in, you can be in the shop instead of out trying to harvest corn that's dry. Wildlife. This is also listed as regional, but there are areas where you may have fields at certain spots on your farm that the deer, the turkeys, the different wildlife may hit certain fields pretty hard and really put a hurting on the production of certain fields if you don't get them harvested early enough. And I'm going to lean towards this is very regional, but this is also can be looked at the same as ambient temperature, where maybe it's minor on your farm. Maybe it's just a couple percent. Maybe it's 1% of your crop gets consumed by wildlife from 25% moisture to 15% moisture. But again, it's a percentage. It costs money. It all adds on to this number at the end. So header loss, yes, you get more head shatter and a little more corn on the ground with dry corn. But with your newer combines, this is not a real big deal. I'm not even going to lean on this as a big part of the loss. The main losses are phantom yield loss, weather, which is snow, wind, and mud, down corn, ruts in the field, ambient temperature, drying drier corn at colder temperatures versus wetter corn at warmer temperatures, wildlife, deer, turkeys, different animals, coons, bear, eating a percentage of your crop. Now, this is really it's a red regional issue. There are areas that this is a big deal. There are areas this is almost non-existent. But, like I said earlier, 1% can add to the total. So how much loss do people report? Phantom yield loss. This is basically how much loss do people report for phantom yield loss. And it's, I've seen reports anywhere from 5% to over 10%. And it will vary from year to year depending on weather. So if you're averaging over 3 years 10%, the numbers are pretty easy to calculate. So 5%, 10%, that's pretty big deal there. Here there's some quick calculations I've put together. 450 corn, 180 bushel to the acre. If that was 200 bushel corn and you deducted 10%, that would be 20 bushel. If you had 189 bushel corn and you deducted 5%, that would be 9 bushel. So we added it up here to $40 an acre or $90 an acre, depending on whether you're losing 5% or 10%, and which is 21 cents a bushel. Added income per bushel of the total amount of corn in your field, and 45 cents per bushel for 10% yield loss. And here you have $6 corn, 180 bushel the acre. 5%, 10% is $54 to $120 per acre. 29 cents a bushel to 60 cents a bushel. What does it cost to dry this corn down from what you're doing for 10% reduction in moisture? What does it cost to dry it down? That's going to vary on the dryer. I got a grain dryer here, Sukup Mix Flow, that I got some dryer specs for, and we look down through here. Our moisture removal, this has a lot of info. It's based on $1.50 a gallon propane, 12 cents a kilowatt hour of electric. And the total comes out to 19 cents per bushel to remove 10% moisture. So the operating cost of this dryer is about 19 cents to remove 10% moisture. Here, if we're at 5% loss on 450 corn, 180 bushel the acre, we're looking at 21 cents a bushel benefits. So at 5% gain, it is almost worth it. You get the 7% gain and you can buy yourself a grain dryer. So would it pay you to harvest your corn earlier? Question is, have you done field trials? Have you done any field trials where you harvest a few fields, half of them earlier when they're 28, 25%, and then the other half of the field when they're 16%? Do this for 3 years in a row. What do you come up with? How many acres of corn do you harvest? Do you harvest 100 acres or do you harvest 3,000 acres? It's going to make a big difference. Do you already own a dryer? If you already own a dryer, Doing your field trial, a walk in the park. This is very simple if you already own a grain dryer. You just go out a couple weeks early, harvest parts of fields, go through, harvest a few fields, depending on how big of a farm you have. Make sure you get a good test amount, 3, 4, 5 fields. Harvest half of them, keep records, harvest the other half. What do you come up with? 3 years of doing records, and you're going to have a good idea of what is going on your farm. I have seen some very interesting numbers, and it has been very interesting to see what some of these trials have come back with. Now, they are going to vary a little bit by area, but the trials have looked very, very interesting, and it's been very interesting. So if you do get into drying 30% corn, it's a little different than when you're drying 20% corn. So some of the grain dryers that work good for drying 19% corn, 20% corn, actually work very poor when it comes to 30% corn. So if you're going to dry 30% corn, make sure you're buying a grain dryer that is proven to work well in that moisture. So thanks for listening, and that's my 2 cents on why or why not you should harvest 25% corn.